The propaganda had painted a picture of savagery, of what awaited captured women. At 22 years old, the Japanese nurse descended from the military transport into the brutal heat of a Texas afternoon. The other captured auxiliaries around her gripped their meager belongings, their gazes flicking nervously toward the American sentries standing tall at the entrance. Her pulse hammered in her chest. Everything she'd been taught insisted these Americans would be undisciplined predators who viewed defeated women as prizes of war. She steeled herself for verbal abuse, physical aggression, perhaps worse. What she encountered instead was silence. The guards maintained their positions, motionless and alert. They stood impressively tall, clearly well-nourished, their uniforms immaculate, weapons held in proper form. Their expressions betrayed nothing except professional routine. An officer approached with someone who would translate. The interpreter's voice cut through the air in sharp Japanese, instructing them to arrange themselves into 2 orderly lines. There were no degrading comments, no lustful stares, merely procedural commands. The prisoners complied, though their thoughts spun wildly. Where was the jeering, the triumphant mockery, the deliberate humiliation? Why did these soldiers conduct themselves as though processing paperwork rather than celebrating conquest? Medical personnel awaited them inside the processing tent, armed with documentation forms. Each woman's personal information was methodically recorded: name, age, military affiliation. They received identification tags. The camp's regulations were carefully outlined. Fraternization was absolutely prohibited. Special treatment would not be granted. No exceptions would be made. The interpreter took great care in translating the facility's governing principle. American military personnel were forbidden from approaching prisoners outside official duties. Personal interaction of any kind was banned. These were Geneva Convention requirements. The words struck like thunder. Some women glanced at each other sideways. They had anticipated unwelcome advances, possibly even attempts at bribery or coercion. Instead, they were being informed of the opposite, an impenetrable barrier of regulations keeping them separate from their captors. The medical examinations that followed maintained this same clinical professionalism. Wounds were dressed efficiently. Body temperatures were recorded. Vaccination histories were verified. No lingering touches occurred. No inappropriate questions were asked. The young nurse sat rigidly on a wooden bench while an American medic attended to her injured wrist. He worked in gloves, communicated through the interpreter, and moved immediately to his next patient without so much as a backward glance. This wasn't the coldness born from hatred. This was the coldness that came from strict procedure, a kind of detached professionalism she had never conceived possible from those she'd been taught to call the enemy. At the tent's far end hung a large notice in both languages that read, "Personal contact between United States personnel and prisoners is forbidden. All prisoner requests must be submitted through camp command." She stared at those words, struggling to reconcile them with every story she'd absorbed back home. This wasn't lenience. This wasn't brutality. This was a refusal to cross boundaries she had assumed existed only in theory. Following the line toward the sleeping quarters, understanding began to dawn. Whatever this place represented, it operated according to rules that superseded rumor. That realization proved more disorienting than any insult could have been. The housing consisted of simple wooden structures arranged in precise rows behind wire barriers. Sunlight streamed through elevated windows inside, illuminating metal bed frames with thin mattresses. The women entered with hesitation, anticipating prison-like conditions. What they discovered instead was organization. Beds were systematically arranged, blankets neatly folded, storage lockers numbered, and regulations posted in both English and Japanese. 2 female interpreters, Women's Army Corps volunteers, stood ready to explain the facility's rules. They distributed uniforms, towels, and printed daily schedules. Breakfast service at 600 hours. Roll call at 700. Lights extinguished at 900. Unauthorized contact with guards was forbidden. Each line of text reinforced the identical message: boundaries, discipline, predictability. Initially, whispered conversations spread among the women. Some had believed American guards would attempt to trade privileges for cooperation. Others had imagined nighttime intrusions and whispered threats. None of it materialized. The guards outside maintained their patrol patterns with clockwork precision. Inside the housing areas, no soldier entered without clearance from a female interpreter. Meals arrived on wheeled carts, delivered by kitchen personnel rather than guards. When one woman spilled her soup in nervousness, a civilian worker simply handed her another without commentary. The young nurse sat on her assigned bunk, clutching the printed regulations in her hands. "This seems impossible," she whispered in Japanese. "They're treating us like hospital patients." Yet the anxiety didn't evaporate immediately. Some prisoners remained suspicious of hidden motives. Was this elaborate theatre designed to create false security? But consistent patterns began to establish themselves over days. Inspections remained brief and impersonal. Supplies were distributed on the same weekly schedule. Medical examinations were conducted routinely, with female staff handling them whenever possible. Not once did a guard violate professional conduct. Their expressions remained polite yet distant, as though they wore invisible masks of discipline. One evening, a guard walked past while the women hung laundry to dry. He deliberately averted his eyes completely, keeping his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The gesture shocked them more profoundly than a stare would have. The young nurse recorded in her diary, "They refuse to look at us. They speak only when duty demands it. It's as if we don't exist except as entries in their records." This realization struck more deeply than cruelty ever could. They were captives, certainly, but also subjects of a system that refused to blur established boundaries. For women raised to expect the opposite, that rejection constituted its own form of shock. Days accumulated, and the rhythms of confinement became almost automatic. Every morning at roll call, the women assembled, counted themselves off, and returned to their quarters without incident. The predictability gradually eroded their fear. No midnight raids occurred. No invasive searches happened. No secret punishments were administered. Instead, there was order, documentation, and schedules. A bulletin board materialized near the dining facility with postings in both languages. It displayed work assignments, mail delivery schedules, and a small notice reading: "Questions should be directed to the interpreter." It was there that the young nurse first witnessed an American guard kneeling to help a prisoner who had stumbled and fallen. He didn't make contact otherwise. He didn't utter a word. He simply assisted her to her feet and stepped back. The action was remarkable in its simplicity. He offered no smile. He didn't delay. He performed an obligation and returned to his station. Some prisoners began recognizing that the guards operated within a framework, strict protocols that governed even acts of kindness. Assistance was provided as a matter of policy, not personal preference. When mail call was announced, the women received blank paper and were informed they could write to their families. This, too, came with restrictions. No specific details about the facility's layout could be included. No coded messages would be permitted. Every letter would be censored. Still, the mere possibility of communicating with home felt like a crack appearing in the wall. The nurse stared at the blank page for an extended period before writing simply, "I remain alive. They treat us according to rules." Around her, other women composed similar messages, their hands trembling as though the act itself might provoke punishment. But no punishment arrived. Gradually, an unfamiliar emotion surfaced: relief. These soldiers were not allies, but they were not predators either. One evening, as sunset coloured the sky behind the wire barriers, the prisoners noticed the guards withdrawing to their own quarters rather than lingering nearby. The boundary was absolute. The young nurse whispered to her bunkmate, "They will not cross that line. It's like a glass wall stands between us." Her bunkmate nodded, still uncertain whether to feel safer or more unsettled. The concept of American soldiers rejecting even simple friendliness contradicted everything they had been taught about the enemy. It wasn't indulgence, it was discipline. Within that discipline existed an unexpected dignity, a peculiar form of respect created through refusal. The facility's rule manual became nearly as familiar to the prisoners as their own memories. It was read aloud bi-weekly by an interpreter, its pages worn from constant handling. No gifts permitted, no favours allowed, no conversation beyond duty requirements. The words were drilled into both guards and prisoners alike. Initially, it sounded like a barrier. Over time, it began to sound like protection. Inside the barracks, whispers evolved into cautious discussions. Women wondered why American soldiers behaved so rigidly. Was it fear? Was it contempt? Or something entirely different? The young nurse overheard two guards conversing outside one evening. They spoke in low English, but the interpreter later clarified. Fraternization with prisoners of war is strictly forbidden. Court-martial awaits anyone who violates it. That revelation spread rapidly among the women. This wasn't merely politeness. This was military law. The Americans had bound themselves to regulations as tightly as the prisoners were bound behind fences. During meals, the separation was obvious. Guards ate at their own tables, positioned far away, their backs turned. Prisoners queued under civilian staff supervision were served and returned to their seats without a single word exchanged. One afternoon, a small group of women attempted to offer hand-sewn items to a guard as gratitude for medical supplies. He refused immediately, stepping backward and signalling to the interpreter to repeat the policy. The refusal left them stunned. In their cultural context, gifts were a method to build obligation, to secure protection. Here, it held no meaning. For the first time, the women began perceiving the Americans not as potential tormentors or potential protectors, but as functionaries of an enormous system. The young nurse began recording in her diary. Their rejection is like steel. They neither hate us nor desire us. They simply perform their work and disappear. This rejection produced a curious effect. Rather than feeling preyed upon, the women began feeling secure. Secure inside walls of discipline they didn't understand, but could begin to predict. At night, the facility fell into quietness. Guards patrolled silently. Lights dimmed at the identical hour. Even the footsteps of the sentries marked time like a metronome. It was in that steadiness that fear started to recede. They still mistrusted, still doubted, but the rhythm of refusal created an unusual sense of order. What had been rumours back home about American soldiers leering, shouting, or worse began to crumble. The myth of dishonor upon capture dissolved not through kindness, but through structure. By the third week, the facility's routines had become second nature. Morning roll call, work assignments, meals, inspections. Yet beneath the surface, a new tension flickered. The women had adjusted to food, beds, and clean clothing, but their minds struggled to reconcile this new reality. Some had begun testing the edges of the rules, curious about the men who guarded them. The young nurse noticed how one of the guards always paused near the medical facility. He didn't speak, didn't stare, but his presence lingered like an unanswered question. She wondered if he might someday speak beyond orders, or if his silence was permanent. One afternoon, she deliberately thanked him in broken English for delivering bandages. He only nodded once and walked away. This rejection startled her more than cruelty would have. It was clean, impersonal, unassailable. Across the barracks, whispers grew. Some women speculated the Americans were forbidden by their own officers. Others insisted the guards were merely waiting for the right moment to reveal their true nature. But the truth remained unchanged. Day after day, no lines were crossed. When guards delivered supplies, they did so through interpreters. When injuries occurred, female medics handled them. The pattern began to create a paradox. The women, once terrified of assault, now found themselves wondering why the soldiers stayed so distant. During meals, the prisoners could observe the guards laughing among themselves, but never with the captives. The separation was a wall of silence constructed from orders and military law. For women raised in a culture where power often blurred into control, this deliberate separation felt alien. "They are like shadows carrying rifles," one whispered. The young nurse wrote in her diary, "I expected monsters. Instead, I found ghosts of discipline." The phrase spread quietly through the barracks like a secret code. Yet even as distance defined their interactions, the prisoners began sensing something else, a kind of reluctance. The Americans' refusal seemed less like contempt than like restraint. Some women admitted privately that this restraint felt safer than any kindness could. "Better a wall than a trap," one said. Heads nodded around her bunk, and so the facility settled into its new normal. No intimacy, no favours, but no violations either. The shock of capture had faded into a muted astonishment at being treated according to rules. By the 4th week, the camp authorities expanded the mail programme. Each woman was permitted to write 1 letter every 2 weeks, inspected but otherwise unaltered. Stacks of envelopes appeared on the mess tables. The interpreter explained addressing procedures, how to sign names in both languages. The act felt ceremonial, like being momentarily reconnected to another world. The young nurse stared at her blank page. For a long moment she couldn't decide what to say. Then she wrote simply, "I am alive. They treat us with rules." Around her, other women scribbled similar notes, each letter a small confession to families still enduring rationing and propaganda. The mail gave the facility a new kind of energy. Women traded paper for pencils, asked interpreters how to phrase sentences, even dared to describe the meals or the medical care they received. Yet they also hesitated. Some letters were torn up and rewritten after second thoughts. Would their families believe them? Would censors delete their words? One evening, the interpreter returned with replies, brief, faintly written, smuggled across oceans. Some of the women cried silently, clutching the envelopes to their chests. In those replies were questions. Is it true? Are you really alive? Do they feed you? For the first time, the women understood how captivity could carry not only shame, but relief for loved ones. The nurse noticed her own tone changing. She no longer wrote only about fear or confusion. She wrote about routine, about learning a few English words, about the quietness of the nights. And she noticed something else. How the Americans enforced the letter rules as strictly as everything else. No personal notes to guards, no thank you gifts included. The separation was complete. This refusal to blur lines between captor and captive created a strange respect. The Americans did not try to win hearts, only to follow regulations. The women began to understand that the guards' rejection of familiarity was not an insult, but a system designed to keep both sides from crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. At night, reading her letter back to herself, the nurse wrote in her diary, "They will not accept gifts, nor kindness, nor closeness. Perhaps that is why I can sleep." For the first time since her capture, she fell asleep before lights out, her breathing steady, no longer waiting for some unseen cruelty. By midsummer, the facility had settled into an almost mechanical rhythm. Wake-up call at dawn, breakfast, assigned work, mail hour, lights out. The fear of early days had faded into a cautious routine. The women began to organise themselves inside the barracks. Some took on cleaning duties. Others taught basic writing to those who had never learned. Even in captivity, small hierarchies and friendships emerged. They still expected the rules to break at any moment. Yet the American soldiers never did. They kept their distance, always polite, always firm. It was discipline transformed into a daily wall. One morning, the young nurse watched a guard issue orders to a group of new prisoners. His tone was clipped, but not cruel. He pointed to the rules posted on the wall, then stepped back, leaving the interpreter to handle details. She realized she had not seen a guard raise his voice in weeks. Not one slap, not one threat. Instead, everything was done through procedure. This consistency eroded her initial fear. The low murmur of American voices outside became background noise, no longer a threat. Letters continued to arrive from Japan. Some brought hope, others brought heartbreak. But each letter made the women feel anchored to their past, even as their present reshaped their beliefs. And with each passing day, they saw how firmly the Americans separated duty from sentiment. No favours, no contact, no special treatment, even for the sick beyond medical care. The nurse began to see the guards differently. They were not cruel men holding power over captives. They were soldiers obeying a code that left little room for abuse, but also little room for connection. It was a paradox she still struggled to reconcile. How could people so careful, so disciplined, also be the enemy in whose name bombs fell on cities she had known? She started sketching the facility in a small notebook. Rows of barracks, towers, the barbed wire. She drew the guards as tall silhouettes, faceless but orderly, like pillars of some invisible architecture. It was in these sketches that she began to understand her own transformation. The drawings were no longer filled with fear. They were diagrams of a system, not monsters. By the 5th week, a subtle transformation had taken hold inside the barracks. What began as disbelief had become reluctant acceptance. What began as fear had become a complicated kind of respect. The women began to talk openly at night about the guards, not with fear, but with curiosity. Why were they so restrained? Why did they act like machines of order rather than men of conquest? Some compared them to the officers they had known back home. Our commanders were visible, loud, one woman said. These ones disappear behind their rules. Heads nodded in the dim light. The nurse began to notice how even small gestures followed patterns. Guards stepping back after handing out supplies, refusing gifts, declining attempts at small talk beyond orders. It wasn't just the rules. It was a culture built on boundaries, a system where soldiers protected not only the captives, but themselves from moral compromise. During afternoon work detail, the women cleaned the kitchen area while American military police supervised from a distance. No harsh words, no pushing. When tasks were done, they were sent back to barracks with simple nods. For women raised in a military culture where hierarchy often blurred into humiliation, this impersonal consistency felt alien. Yet it also felt secretly safer. At night, the nurse thought of her family and of Japan. She wondered what her brothers would say if they could see her now. Fed, clothed, guarded by men who treated her with rules instead of fists. She found herself writing differently in her letters. Instead of fear, she wrote about routines. Instead of humiliation, she wrote about order. They do not treat us as enemies, she wrote. They treat us as obligations. The letters were censored, but still allowed through. Somewhere across the ocean, families read words that contradicted everything they had been told about American barbarity. Some women whispered that maybe this discipline was America's true strength, not weapons, but the ability to enforce boundaries even over prisoners. Others argued it was strategy, a way to collect intelligence or show off for propaganda. But even the skeptics admitted they felt less fear now than at any time since capture. The nurse began to feel an unexpected shift inside herself. The Americans' rejection of intimacy no longer felt like an insult. It felt like proof that she existed beyond being an object of war. In her diary, she wrote, "Their refusal is a strange kind of respect. I do not know why this feels like freedom." Late summer evenings in the facility brought a strange calm. Crickets outside the wire sang against the low hum of generators, and the sky above turned deep red-orange before fading to black. Inside the barracks, women folded their blankets with a precision that mirrored the guards' own habits. The nurse sat at her bunk writing again. Her letters had grown longer. "We are safe. They do not cross lines. We work. We eat. We live," she wrote in careful handwriting. For the first time since the surrender, she began to plan for a future. Not a heroic escape or a glorious death, but a future with days that followed one another without terror. The guards, for their part, maintained their distance with iron consistency. No gifts, no personal questions, no favours beyond what regulations allowed. Some of the younger women had tried early on to test the boundaries with flirtations or compliments. Every time the guards responded the same way, stepping back, redirecting, or reporting the interaction to a superior. It wasn't cruelty. It was a refusal that left no ambiguity. The women began to understand that this too was policy. The Americans would not risk their code for sentiment. And strangely, this refusal began to feel like its own form of safety. They no longer feared being singled out or exploited. In rejecting closeness, the guards had made every woman equally invisible and therefore equally protected. At night, the nurse remembered the officers she had served under in Japan. She remembered slaps, insults, long marches under fever, and the humiliation of being treated as expendable. The contrast was dizzying. She realized now that what she had once thought of as strength, cruelty, and arbitrary power was only another form of weakness. The Americans' restraint, frustrating as it was, demanded a stronger discipline than violence ever had. Some women whispered that perhaps this was why America was winning the war, not because of weapons, but because of systems and self-control. The idea felt dangerous to say aloud, yet it spread quietly. The nurse closed her diary. The guards' shadows passed along the outside of the barracks like clock hands. She no longer trembled at the sight of them. She still did not know how long captivity would last, or what waited beyond the wire. But she knew now, in a way she hadn't before, that she would survive it with her dignity intact. Autumn wind rattled the barbed wire, scattering dry leaves across the compound. The once harsh sunlight of midsummer had mellowed, and the days grew shorter. For the women inside the barracks, time itself felt different now, not like a sentence, but like a season. The nurse watched the guards at morning roll call. Their uniforms were the same, their expressions the same. But she now understood the pattern. The meticulous checking of names, the exact spacing of steps, the deliberate way orders were delivered. It was all part of a structure designed to keep chaos at bay. She no longer mistook it for coldness. She saw it as the same discipline that kept them from exploiting her vulnerability. In her diary, she wrote, "At first, I feared their distance. Now I see it as a wall built to keep both sides safe. It is the strangest kindness I have known." Other women murmured similar thoughts. They had gone from dread to confusion, then to grudging acceptance, and now to something closer to relief. They could predict the guards' behaviour, and in predictability they found an unexpected kind of freedom. One afternoon, during work detail in the garden, the women were given extra time to tend the plants they had sown. Small green shoots stood where bare dirt had been weeks before, a living metaphor for their own slow transformation. The guards stayed back, watching quietly. No shouts, no interruptions. The women worked in silence, feeling the sun on their faces, their hands in the soil. For a brief moment, the war seemed far away. The nurse thought of her mother again, of home, of a life beyond uniforms and salutes. She did not yet know if Japan would win or lose, but she did know that the world she had been raised to believe in had cracked. At night, the barracks smelled faintly of soap and dried leaves. Women whispered about what they would do after the war. Go back to nursing, open a small shop, or simply disappear into family life. They no longer whispered about dying with honour. The Americans' rejection of intimacy had done something her own army never could. It had forced her to see herself as a person, not just a function of a war machine. She realized that her identity no longer depended on how men saw her or how officers judged her worth. Her identity was built from the small acts of survival she performed each day, folding a blanket, tending a plant, writing a letter. The guard's flashlight swept across the barracks one last time before lights out. She met his eyes briefly, and he looked away, as always, keeping his distance. In that tiny gesture was the entire story of her captivity. She lay down on her bunk, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. She was still a prisoner, still far from home, but the terror that had greeted her arrival was gone. In its place was a strange steadiness, a knowledge that she would leave this camp as herself. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind through the wire. She no longer imagined rifles or punishments waiting at dawn. She imagined instead the sound of waves at home, a train station, her mother's voice.